The fluorescent lights of the roadside motel flickered overhead as the man in the expensive suit fumbled with his wedding ring, sliding it off his finger and into his jacket pocket. In just 3 hours, he would be standing behind a pulpit, preaching to thousands about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of moral purity. But right now, in room 237 of the Desert Sands Motel, he was about to become someone else entirely. This isn't the beginning of a Hollywood thriller. This is the true story of how one of America's most influential religious leaders managed to fool millions of followers, his own family, and perhaps even himself, for over 2 decades. A man who built an empire on family values while living a life that contradicted everything he claimed to believe. The year was 1985, and evangelical Christianity was experiencing unprecedented political influence in America. Religious leaders weren't just shepherding their flocks, they were shaping policy, influencing elections, and becoming household names. Into this landscape stepped a charismatic young pastor with piercing blue eyes and an infectious smile. Let's call him Pastor David Morrison. Morrison had everything the evangelical movement needed. He was articulate, photogenic, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to connect with audiences. When he spoke about the breakdown of American families, grown men wept. When he condemned the moral decay of society, entire congregations rose to their feet in thunderous applause. He had that rare gift that separates ordinary preachers from religious superstars. He made people believe that God was speaking directly through him. Born in rural Oklahoma to a farming family, Morrison's path to religious stardom wasn't predetermined. His father was a quiet Methodist who rarely spoke about faith, and his mother, while devout, was more concerned with putting food on the table than theological debates. David was their middle child, neither the responsible eldest nor the coddled youngest. Perhaps it was this position that taught him early how to read a room, how to give people what they wanted to hear. In high school, Morrison discovered he had a talent for public speaking. His drama teacher, Mrs. Patterson, later recalled that David had an unusual quality. He could become completely different people on stage, so thoroughly that she sometimes forgot she was watching a performance. It was almost unsettling, she would say years later, when the truth finally came out. He didn't just play characters, he inhabited them. After a brief stint at a state college studying business, Morrison experienced what he described as a divine calling during his sophomore year. The way he told it, and he told it often, he was walking across campus one evening when he heard God's voice as clearly as if someone had spoken beside him. The voice told him to abandon his worldly pursuits and dedicate his life to spreading the gospel. Within months, Morrison had transferred to a small Bible college and thrown himself into his studies with the intensity of a man possessed. His professors were amazed by his dedication, his fellow students inspired by his passion. He graduated summa cum laude and immediately began working as an assistant pastor at a mid-sized church in Texas. But Morrison had bigger dreams than being someone's assistant forever. In 1982, at the age of 28, he convinced a group of investors to help him start his own church. The New Covenant Family Church began in a rented high school gymnasium with just 47 members. Morrison promised them something different, a church that would fight for traditional values in an increasingly secular world. The timing couldn't have been better. America in the early 1980s was experiencing what historians now call the culture wars. Traditional religious communities felt under siege from feminism, gay rights activism, and what they perceived as Hollywood's assault on family values. Morrison positioned himself as a warrior in this battle, and his congregation grew exponentially. By 1985, New Covenant had built a massive complex that seated 4,000 people, and Morrison's Sunday services were being broadcast to millions more on television. He had written 3 best-selling books about strengthening families, appeared on dozens of talk shows, and was regularly consulted by Republican politicians seeking to court the evangelical vote. Morrison's message was simple but powerful. The American family was under attack, and only a return to biblical principles could save it. He spoke with authority about the importance of wives submitting to their husbands, children obeying their parents, and men taking spiritual leadership in their homes. His own family seemed to embody these principles perfectly. Morrison had married his college sweetheart, Sarah, a quiet woman with kind eyes who seemed content to live in her husband's shadow. They had 3 children together, 2 boys and a girl, who were frequently featured in the church's promotional materials as examples of proper Christian parenting. The Morrison family appeared to be living proof that his teachings worked. Behind the scenes, however, cracks were beginning to show. Church staff members later reported that Morrison could be explosively angry when things didn't go his way. He demanded absolute loyalty from his employees and had a disturbing tendency to fire anyone who questioned his decisions. He also began exhibiting what his closest associates described as unusual behavior patterns. Morrison started taking frequent business trips, often with little explanation about where he was going or what he was doing. He would disappear for days at a time, claiming he was visiting other churches or attending conferences. When staff members tried to verify these trips, they found that Morrison often wasn't where he claimed to be. There were other odd details that, in retrospect, should have raised red flags. Morrison's assistant noticed that he received a lot of mail addressed to different names, all with his initials but with different first and last names. When she asked about it, Morrison claimed it was fan mail from confused viewers who got his name wrong. Morrison also began insisting on handling all of his own travel arrangements and expense reports, something that struck his business manager as unusual for someone who typically delegated such mundane tasks. When pressed, Morrison explained that he wanted to be personally responsible for stewardship of God's money. The truth was far more complicated. Morrison had been living a double life almost from the moment he entered ministry. The divine calling he claimed to have experienced in college was real enough, but so was his attraction to a lifestyle that was the complete opposite of everything he preached. Morrison had discovered that when he traveled to other cities, he could become someone else entirely. He had developed elaborate personas, complete with fake business cards, identification, and backstories. In Dallas, he was Michael David, a successful businessman who enjoyed the finer things in life. In Las Vegas, he was Dave Morris, a wealthy investor with expensive tastes and few moral constraints. These weren't just casual deceptions. Morrison had put considerable effort into creating and maintaining these alternate identities. He had bank accounts under different names, cell phones that only certain people knew about, and even maintained separate wardrobes for his different personas. The man who preached against materialism owned luxury cars that he kept in storage facilities across 3 states. But Morrison's double life went far beyond expensive toys. The pastor who built his reputation condemning sexual immorality was regularly visiting prostitutes during his business trips. The man who preached about the sanctity of marriage was having affairs with multiple women, including at least 2 members of his own congregation. Morrison's ability to compartmentalize was almost supernatural. On Sunday mornings, he could deliver passionate sermons about sexual purity with the same conviction that had made him famous, apparently feeling no contradiction between his words and his actions. Church members who knew him well described him as a man who seemed to genuinely believe everything he said, even when his behavior suggested otherwise. Psychologists who later studied Morrison's case identified this as a form of dissociation. His different identities weren't just deceptions, they were separate personas that allowed him to psychologically separate his various lives. Pastor Morrison, the family man and moral leader, was as real to him as Michael David, the successful businessman with questionable ethics. Before we continue with this incredible story, I want to take a moment to thank you for watching Professor Archive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating cases of deception and double lives, please consider hitting that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Are you a student, a professional, or maybe someone with your own interesting career? Drop a comment and let me know. If you're really enjoying the content and want to support the channel, a super thanks would mean the world to me. Now let's get back to Pastor Morrison's incredible story, because things are about to get much more complicated. For nearly 15 years, Morrison successfully maintained his multiple identities. He was helped by the fact that this was the pre-internet era, when background checks were less thorough and it was easier to maintain separate lives in different cities. He was also aided by the somewhat insular nature of evangelical Christianity. His followers trusted him completely and rarely questioned his explanations for his frequent absences. Morrison's wife, Sarah, later admitted that she had suspected something was wrong, but had been taught by her church, led by her own husband, that wives should not question their husbands' decisions. She noticed that Morrison often seemed distracted at home, that he received mysterious phone calls at odd hours, and that their joint bank account sometimes showed large unexplained expenses. But when she tried to discuss these concerns, Morrison would become angry and accuse her of not trusting God's chosen leader. The beginning of the end came in 1999 when Morrison made a crucial mistake. During one of his trips to Las Vegas as Dave Morris, he encountered another pastor from his own denomination who was attending a conference in the city. Morrison, in full character as his businessman persona, didn't recognize the pastor and struck up a conversation with him at a casino bar. The pastor, who knew Morrison by reputation but had never met him in person, was struck by how much this businessman resembled the famous televangelist. But the resemblance was so perfect, and Dave Morris's behavior so different from what anyone would expect from Pastor Morrison, that the pastor dismissed it as coincidence. However, the encounter troubled the pastor enough that he mentioned it to a colleague back home. That colleague happened to know someone who attended New Covenant, and the story eventually made its way to a deacon in Morrison's own church. The deacon began paying closer attention to Morrison's schedule and noticed patterns that troubled him. Meanwhile, Morrison's double life was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The stress of keeping track of multiple identities, relationships, and financial obligations was beginning to take its toll. Church staff noticed that he seemed more anxious and paranoid than usual. He began accusing loyal employees of disloyalty and started demanding that all church communications go through him personally. Morrison also made the fatal error of allowing his two worlds to begin overlapping. He started using church funds to support his alternate lifestyles, justifying it to himself as compensation for his spiritual labor. He also began introducing elements from his secular personas into his religious life. Expensive suits, jewelry, and an increasingly lavish lifestyle that raised eyebrows among some congregation members. The catalyst for Morrison's downfall came from an unexpected source: his own son. David Morrison Jr., who was 22 at the time and working as an assistant youth pastor at New Covenant, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with what he saw as his father's hypocrisy. The younger Morrison had noticed his father's mood swings, his secretive behavior, and his increasingly materialistic lifestyle. More troubling to David Jr. was what he perceived as his father's lack of genuine spirituality in private. The man who moved thousands with his passionate preaching seemed to have little interest in prayer, Bible study, or spiritual matters when the cameras weren't rolling. David Jr. later described his father as someone who seemed to view Christianity as a business rather than a faith. In early 2000, David Jr. made a decision that would change everything. He hired a private investigator to follow his father during one of his business trips. The investigator, a former police detective named Robert Chen, was initially skeptical. The young man's story seemed too outlandish to be true. But Chen was thorough, and what he discovered exceeded even David Jr.'s worst suspicions. Chen followed Morrison to 3 different cities over a 2-month period and documented a pattern of behavior that was the complete opposite of everything the pastor claimed to believe. The investigator obtained photographs, credit card records, and witness statements that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning nearly 2 decades. When David Jr. confronted his father with the evidence, Morrison's reaction was telling. Rather than showing remorse or attempting to explain his behavior, Morrison became enraged and accused his son of being influenced by Satan. He threatened to disown David Jr. and have him removed from the church if he spoke about what he had discovered. But Morrison had badly misjudged his son. David Jr. was not the compliant child his father expected, and he was deeply troubled by the impact his father's hypocrisy was having on the thousands of people who trusted him. Against his father's threats, David Jr. took the evidence to the church's board of deacons. The deacons' initial reaction was disbelief. Morrison had been their spiritual leader for 18 years, and the idea that he could be living such a dramatically different life seemed impossible. However, Chen's evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss. The board made the difficult decision to confront Morrison directly. The confrontation took place on a Tuesday evening in March 2000 in the church's conference room. Morrison arrived expecting a routine board meeting and found himself facing a table full of grim-faced men and a stack of photographs that documented his secret life. According to witnesses, Morrison's first reaction was not denial but a kind of confused surprise, as if he genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would have a problem with his behavior. When the reality of the situation finally sank in, Morrison attempted several different explanations. He claimed he was conducting undercover ministry to reach sinners in their own environment. He suggested that he was gathering material for a book about the temptations facing modern Christians. He even briefly attempted to argue that his actions were being taken out of context. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and Morrison's explanations too obviously fabricated. The board gave him an ultimatum: confess publicly, seek professional help, and step down from leadership, or face exposure and public disgrace. Morrison asked for time to consider his options, and the board agreed to wait until Sunday, giving him 5 days to make his decision. What happened next surprised everyone, including Morrison's own family. Rather than face the consequences of his actions, Morrison simply disappeared. On Thursday morning, Sarah Morrison woke up to find her husband gone, along with several suitcases and what appeared to be a significant amount of cash from their personal accounts. Morrison left behind a brief note that read, "I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. Don't try to find me. I need time to figure out who I really am." It was signed simply David, not Pastor Morrison or Dad or any of the other titles he had worn for so many years. The church board faced an impossible situation. They had planned to allow Morrison to confess and seek redemption, which would have been consistent with their beliefs about forgiveness and restoration. Instead, they found themselves having to explain to a congregation of 4,000 people why their beloved pastor had suddenly vanished. On the Sunday morning when Morrison was supposed to make his confession, the church's senior deacon instead took the pulpit and delivered what many witnesses described as the most difficult sermon they had ever heard. He explained as gently as possible that Pastor Morrison had been living a life that was inconsistent with Christian principles and had chosen to leave rather than face the consequences of his actions. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Many congregation members refused to believe the accusations, insisting that Morrison was being persecuted by jealous rivals or liberal enemies. Others felt so betrayed that they left Christianity entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with their leader's deception. The church, which had been thriving under Morrison's leadership, lost nearly half its membership within 6 months. The scandal didn't remain contained within the church community. Morrison's disappearance made national news, and investigative journalists began uncovering additional details about his double life. It emerged that Morrison's deceptions went even deeper than the church board had realized. He had been operating under at least 7 different identities and had accumulated significant debts and legal troubles in several states. More troubling were the personal testimonies that began to emerge. Several women came forward with stories of affairs and manipulative relationships with Morrison. Some described a man who used his religious authority to pressure them into compromising situations, always with the justification that God had revealed to him that their relationship was somehow part of his plan. Perhaps most disturbing were the accounts from former staff members who described Morrison's increasingly erratic behavior in the months before his disappearance. They painted a picture of a man who seemed to have lost the ability to distinguish between his various personas, sometimes speaking to church employees as if they were business associates from his secular life. Morrison's family was left to deal with the aftermath of his deceptions. Sarah Morrison faced the impossible task of explaining to her children why their father had abandoned them, while also dealing with the financial and legal mess he had left behind. The family lost their home when it was discovered that Morrison had taken out multiple mortgages against the property using his various identities. David Jr., who had triggered the investigation, found himself in the difficult position of being both the whistleblower who exposed his father's crimes and the son who had lost his family. He later wrote about the experience, describing the internal conflict between his love for his father and his obligation to protect the people his father was deceiving. For months after Morrison's disappearance, there were occasional sightings reported from across the country. Someone matching his description was spotted in Portland, then Miami, then Denver. Private investigators hired by the church and by creditors continued searching for him, but Morrison seemed to have vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The truth about Morrison's whereabouts remained a mystery for over 3 years. Then, in 2003, a routine traffic stop in Phoenix led to the arrest of a man calling himself Daniel Mitchell for driving with fraudulent identification. When police ran his fingerprints, they discovered they had found the missing pastor. Morrison had spent the intervening years living under yet another assumed identity, working as a sales manager for a construction company. His coworkers described Daniel Mitchell as a quiet, reliable employee who never talked about his past and seemed to have no close relationships. He lived alone in a small apartment and appeared to have built himself a completely ordinary, unremarkable life. When confronted with his true identity, Morrison initially denied being the pastor, claiming that the police had made a mistake. However, when investigators presented him with evidence from his fingerprints and other identifying information, he finally acknowledged who he was. The man they arrested bore little resemblance to the charismatic preacher who had disappeared 3 years earlier. Morrison had gained weight, his hair had gone gray, and he seemed somehow smaller than the commanding figure who had once held audiences spellbound. Most remarkably, he seemed genuinely confused about why anyone was still looking for him. In interviews with police and later with psychiatrists, Morrison displayed what experts described as a profound disconnection from the consequences of his actions. He acknowledged that he had left his family and his church, but he seemed unable to understand why people were upset about it. He described his various identities as different aspects of my personality, and couldn't seem to grasp why anyone would consider them deceptive. Morrison was extradited back to his home state to face charges of fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. During his trial, the full scope of his deceptions became public. Prosecutors revealed that Morrison had stolen over $2 million from his church, had committed credit card fraud in 4 states, and had used his position as a pastor to manipulate and exploit numerous women. The trial became a media sensation, partly because Morrison's behavior during the proceedings was so bizarre. He seemed to view the entire process as a misunderstanding that could be cleared up if only he could explain himself properly. He insisted that he had never intended to hurt anyone and couldn't understand why people were so angry with him. Mental health experts who examined Morrison diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder and what they described as dissociative identity features. They explained that Morrison likely genuinely believed in each of his various personas while he was inhabiting them, which allowed him to preach about morality while living immorally without experiencing the psychological conflict that would trouble most people. Morrison was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in prison for his financial crimes. The judge noted that while Morrison's mental health issues might explain his behavior, they didn't excuse the harm he had caused to hundreds of people who had trusted him. The case of Pastor Morrison, though that's not his real name, represents one of the most extreme examples of religious hypocrisy in modern American history. But it also raises troubling questions about the nature of religious authority and the systems that allow charismatic leaders to operate with minimal oversight. Experts who studied the case identified several factors that enabled Morrison's deceptions to continue for so long. The evangelical culture's emphasis on submission to spiritual authority made it difficult for congregation members to question their pastor's behavior. The lack of formal accountability structures within independent churches meant that Morrison answered to no higher authority than his own board of deacons, who were predisposed to trust him. Perhaps most importantly, Morrison's case highlighted the dangers of what psychologists call compartmentalization, the ability to separate different aspects of one's life so completely that contradictory behaviors don't create psychological conflict. While most people experience some degree of compartmentalization, Morrison's case was extreme enough to suggest underlying mental health issues. The aftermath of Morrison's case led to significant changes within many evangelical organizations. churches began implementing stronger financial oversight systems, requiring multiple signatures for large expenditures and regular independent audits. Many denominations also established protocols for investigating allegations against clergy members and providing support for victims of clerical abuse. Morrison's family eventually rebuilt their lives, though the process was long and difficult. Sarah Morrison remarried several years later and became an advocate for church reform and transparency. David Jr. left the ministry but remained active in advocating for accountability within religious organizations. The New Covenant Family Church never fully recovered from the scandal. The congregation dwindled to fewer than 200 members within 5 years of Morrison's disappearance, and the building was eventually sold to pay off debts he had accumulated. Some former members started new churches with strict accountability measures, while others left organized religion entirely. Morrison himself was released from prison in 2012 after serving 8 years of his sentence. He reportedly moved to a small town in another state and took a job in retail sales under his legal name. Those who encountered him described a quiet, unremarkable man who showed no interest in returning to religious leadership or public life. The story of Pastor Morrison serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the human capacity for self-deception. It demonstrates how charisma and religious authority can be used to mask profound character flaws and even criminal behavior. Most importantly, it reminds us that the people we place on pedestals are ultimately just human beings with all the frailties and weaknesses that entails. In an age where religious and political leaders continue to fall from grace with depressing regularity, Morrison's story feels almost prophetic. It shows us what can happen when we give any individual too much power and too little oversight, regardless of how righteous or holy they may appear. The case also raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of faith itself. For many of Morrison's former followers, the revelation of his deceptions didn't just destroy their trust in him, it shattered their ability to trust any religious authority. Some found their way back to faith through different communities and leaders, while others never recovered from the betrayal. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Morrison's story is how completely unnecessary it was. Had he sought help for his psychological issues early in his career? Had his church implemented proper accountability measures? Had anyone in his circle felt empowered to question his behavior? The damage to hundreds of lives might have been prevented. Instead, Morrison's case stands as a reminder that trust once broken is almost impossible to fully restore. The people who believed in him, who built their lives around his teachings, who trusted him with their spiritual welfare, they were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered faith and somehow find a way forward. Today, more than 2 decades after his fall from grace, Morrison remains a cautionary tale studied in seminaries and psychology classes. His story is taught as an example of how mental illness, unchecked power, and institutional failure can combine to create devastating consequences for everyone involved. The man who once commanded the attention of millions now lives in obscurity, his name synonymous with hypocrisy and betrayal. His legacy is not the spiritual empire he built, but the wreckage he left behind. Broken families, shattered faith, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from obvious enemies, but from those we trust the most. In the end, Pastor Morrison's story is not just about one man's spectacular fall from grace. It's about the systems that enabled his deception, the people who suffered from his betrayals, and the ongoing challenge of holding our leaders accountable while still maintaining the trust that makes community possible. It's a story that, unfortunately, remains as relevant today as it was when Morrison first disappeared into the desert night, leaving behind only questions and the wreckage of countless broken dreams. And that's where we'll leave this incredible story. If this deep dive into one of history's most shocking cases of religious deception has given you something to think about, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to Professor Archive for more fascinating historical investigations. What did you think of Morrison's story? Have you ever encountered someone living a double life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, things are rarely as simple as they first appear.